Well, good morning. I'm glad I got to come back today. So who all was here last time I spoke? That was, I guess, a month or two ago, maybe. So we're going to kind of progress from what we talked about last time. So last time, does anybody remember what we talked about? That was a while back. But we were talking about how we know that God exists. And we looked at some laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, and different ways that we have confidence that God must exist. We first talked about that the universe is not eternal, so it must have a beginning. It requires some sort of cause. And we kind of walked through that means the cause could not be the universe itself, because something outside of the universe has to bring it into being. And so that's one of many different ways that we can look at knowing that, that a God must exist. Oops. I'm not sure what's going on with the slide, but we'll just keep rolling. Okay, so today though, we're going to talk about the teleological argument. And teleology is just a big fancy word to say design. So we're looking at where things show design and purpose, there must be some designer or some intelligence behind it to give it that purpose, to give it that order and organization to it. So last time we talked about the cosmological argument that says, the universe is here, its existence must be explained in some way. And so this time we're going to talk about different features of this universe that still indicate that something intelligent must have been behind that to create it and to put that order and design into it. So this next slide, we can kind of look at the fact that if there's a painting that has design and order and planning to it, so that you can recognize that this is a person, that this is a woman that was painted, we know that somewhere behind that there must be a painter. Somebody had to intentionally put those brush strokes and those colors together in an organized fashion in order for us to see this. So we're kind of drawing the same analogy from looking at, if we can look out into the world and see that there's design and order, there must be some designer behind it. So we're pulling on this idea of that presumption of fact that we kind of introduced last time that says the most logical conclusion, if you were to walk into a room and see this painting, is that somewhere there's a painter. Even though you might not have seen the painter, you might not have seen it being painted, you don't know who the painter was, somewhere someone is putting design and intent into this so that you can recognize these features that are here. Now, this is not a new argument for the existence of God. In fact, back in the 1800s, a man named William Paley kind of put this idea together, and he called it the watchmaker argument. And what he said is, if you were walking through the woods and you found a watch lying on the ground and you picked it up and you noticed that there's cogs and gears and springs all integrated together, sized the right way, and put together in an organized, orderly fashion in order to keep time, the presumption of fact, the logical conclusion that you would draw is that there's a watchmaker somewhere. And so he made that connection that if we look out into the world and we see these watches, these things that have intricate, detailed design to them, then there must be some designer behind it. Now, atheists are going to agree that design requires a designer, but they're going to look out into the universe and say there's not any actual design to it. So the real question that we're having to answer is not, does a painting require a painter, but is there actually a painting in the universe? So we're really going to kind of explore that today of what do we see in the universe that tells us that there is this orderly design to it, or could it be explained by a random process? Because that's kind of the opposite. If you're going to have an orderly design system, the opposite of that would be chaotic, unorganized randomness. Okay, so kind of our time's leading evolutionist Richard Dawkins. If I can get back to the right slide. There we go. He's explained it this way because he's trying to combat this idea of this watchmaker. And he said there may be good reasons to believe in God, but the argument from design is not one of them. So he's saying despite all the appearances of the contrary, there is no watchmaker. It's just the blind forces of physics. So he's saying there is no mind, there is no mind's eye, it does not plan for the future, there's no vision and foresight, no sight at all in the universe. So he's really saying there is no orderly design. So the final sentence here in this quote, he says, if it can be said to play the role of a watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. And he's making the statement specifically to combat this idea of William Paley's watchmaker argument. So that's what we have to look at, because Dawkins is saying everything can be explained by some random process, some random blind forces of physics. So really our question is there design in the universe? And many atheists start with the idea that there are examples of non-design. Now, what do you think that would mean? Things that look random, things that don't appear orderly, that they think show this is the result of random processes found through nature. One example that they often give is the appendix. So some people say that's just this useless organ that sometimes can get infected and you remove it and you go on with your life. There's no need for this appendix. So the argument from the atheists would be that this clearly nobody designed the human to leave this non-functioning, purposeless organ there. That must be the process of a random thing through nature. But what we have to caution ourselves with looking at it from that perspective is that non-designed features can sometimes be explained. Sometimes things might appear that they're useless or purposeless, but they actually do serve a purpose that we discover later on. So a good example of that would be found with the panda's thumb. The panda basically has this 6th digit that's down in the bottom of its palm, basically. And Dr. Jay Gould, he's the leading proponent of this idea of non-design being evidence that there is no God, says he actually wrote a book called The Panda's Thumb, and he's saying this digit is completely useless to the panda. So this is some suboptimal design that's shown up that clearly means nothing intelligent would have created the panda to look this way. He says these odd arrangements and funny solutions are the proof of evolution, paths that a sensible God would not take. So he's using this as an example to say there can't be a God because we have this random useless thing here in the panda. But it turns out, as people researched it further, the 6th digit is actually allows the panda the ability to grip things as tightly and with as much precision as humans. And it really enables them to be able to eat their main diet, which is bamboo. Okay, so we've also discovered that there is quite a purpose to the appendix. Maybe not something in our first world culture, but it functions like a storehouse for good bacteria. So that if you're in a place with cholera or dysentery or things that might wipe out your digestive system, your appendix kind of functions as an organ to reboot everything with your digestive system to put that good bacteria back into your system. So here we have 2 examples of things that look like they're not designed, that they're purposeless, that they would say a good, intelligent creator would never put that into the system. And turns out they do have a purpose. We just weren't aware of it earlier on. So the other problem is that when we say things are suboptimal, is that we're setting ourselves up to judge what is optimal, what is the best design. And we can kind of see that in some of the quotes that many atheists give about this idea. So Douglas Atuma, he says, the case for evolution has evidence that the natural world does not conform to our expectation of what an omnipotent, omniscient, truthful creator would have created. Okay, so here he's saying it doesn't look like how I would have designed it, therefore it can't be designed. That's pretty bold and presumptuous to set yourself up in that level to say you're going to determine what is the best design. And so it's really this arrogant kind of approach to say if it doesn't fit the way I would have built it, it can't be designed. And that's not really an adequate way to look at the evidence that we see in nature. Sometimes what we judge as non-design is really what we would describe from a biblical perspective as the degeneration of nature, right? We know that since sin entered into the world, things are decaying, things are breaking down. So things are not going to look in their perfect, pristine state as they would have when they were first created. But that doesn't mean there's not a creator either. For example, if you were to dig around in your grandmother's attic and you find a really old book, and the cover's worn off and the pages are really yellowed and dusty, maybe some pages are torn out, maybe the ink is smudged everywhere, would you look at that and say, clearly there's no author? No, you would say clearly this is suffering from decay and things are breaking down. But you can still see because there's words and there's letters and it's put together with syntax and logical understanding of language, that there must be an author somewhere. So sometimes when we look out into nature, that's what we have to consider as well. That just because the product sometimes might be broken down doesn't mean that the system that produced that design thing is not there. So the existence of that orderly mechanism is what demands a designer. So kind of this first part is to say that just because we might see things that are non-designed or maybe look random or haphazard does not negate the existence of a designer. Sometimes it's things we don't know what the purpose is. Sometimes it's things that maybe it is the best design, but we don't really understand how that worked. So to kind of go back to our painting example, you could walk into a room and see paint splatters all over the walls as if our children were let loose with paint cans and just let them have at it. Lots of randomness, lots of chaos, right? You don't need a designer for that. But if still in the corner, you had the Mona Lisa hanging, you still have to have the painter. Okay, so even if there are things that are random and maybe don't appear that they belong in the right way, if we have this painting, then we still have to have a designer. In other words, even if we really did not have a purpose for the appendix, that does not negate the existence of DNA, which is coded information in your cells. So that would be the painting that still requires some painter. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at this idea of how an atheist usually combats this idea of design, let's start looking at what is the positive evidence that things are designed in nature. Where are these paintings in our biology? Well, we're going to start first with the universe. And our universe is incredibly precise. When you think about all the different laws of physics, all these different physical parameters that must be exactly the values that they are in order for life to exist, things that we take for granted, things that we don't really have to think about sometimes. But if this universe were generated out of randomness, then that means these values of all of these laws and parameters could have been anything out of infinity, right? It could have been any number. There's infinite possibilities what these values could be. So if we look at one such thing like gravity, okay, it is precisely what it needs to be here on Earth in order for life to exist here. So this is really, the odds are not 1 out of 10 that it fell in that number, but it's really 1 out of infinity because it could have been anything. But the problem is it's not just gravity that has to be exactly what it is for life to exist. We have all of these other physical parameters that have to be precisely what they are in order for life to exist. And we have this compounding probability issue when we have all of these values that have to be exactly what they are in order for life to exist. And this is something called anaerobic fine-tuning. And it's talking about that precision, that it's not just each individual value is what it needs to be, but all of them together are what they need to be. And so the probability of that happening is near zero when you look at really how we calculate probability of things. So one example is we can look at the precision of just where Earth is located, right? All of the things that make life be able to exist here. The way, how fast we rotate on our axis, how fast we revolve around the sun, how close we are to the moon. Even the gravitational pull of Jupiter helps pull meteors away from Earth so that we're not struck by things traveling through space. The relationship between plants and humans, of what they put out as oxygen and what we need to breathe in as oxygen, and we put out carbon dioxide, which is what the plants need. And even how many plants that there are in order to sustain life. All of these things are exactly what they need to be and work in this symbiotic way in order for life to exist here. And so we have to go back to that idea, that presumption of fact. What is more likely, that these things randomly fell into place so that life could exist, or that somebody planned it out this way and structured these things and ordered these things so that life could exist here? Even Richard Dawkins admits, I think I have that quote in here too, that the more statistically improbable a thing is, the less we can believe that it just happened by blind chance. So superficially, the obvious alternative to chance is an intelligent designer. Now, of course, he's going to say, pay no attention to all these things, because he's still going to say there is no intelligent designer. But what he's saying is these things are not likely to fall into place on their own. And if it's statistically improbable for that to happen, there must be someone or something intelligent setting it that way, and designing it that way, and setting it up that way. So this highly complex, interconnected, and perfectly symbiotic universe could not have come from a big bang of chaos, from blind forces of nature. And that's kind of what we're trying to show here about where we're even located in space, how all of these physical forces work together. It must be something that was intelligent that designed it this way and set it up to function this way. Now that's on a really big scale. We can also look down on a really small scale in biology, even all the way down to our cells, and look at this intricate design. And again, go back to that, what is the most logical conclusion? That this fell out of a random, natural, chaotic process, or that something designed it? Okay, so this is just an image of the cell and all the different organelles that function inside of it. The cell it represents the smallest unit of life. So every living thing is made up of cells, but they're amazingly complex. In fact, most textbooks even describe this as a factory. We'll talk about what that is and kind of how that almost proves that there must be an intelligent designer when we even make that comparison of a cell to a factory. But is the cell's complexity, all of these moving pieces, is it a result of a random natural process, or do we think it's better explained by an intelligent designer? That's what we always have to go back to and compare. Which one is the most likely explanation? Because if something complex could not have been assembled by that random process, then it has to be designed. Okay, so we're going to talk about just 3 major components of the cell. Don't worry, we're not going to go completely into biology class because I know it's summer and some of y'all have decided we're not going to learn science in the summer, right? So we'll keep it top level. Okay, so the first component is the cell membrane. And they have some amazing pictures of these different parts of the cell. So this is a detailed image of a cell membrane, okay? Now, it seems very simple. It's basically there to keep it from being the cell from being a blob on your lab test bench, right? It holds everything together. But it does have a really important function. It has to let some things in and some things out. What do you think it has to let in?
Nutrients.
Nutrients, right? So it can grow and it can continue to live. What does it have to let out? Waste, right? Okay, what if it gets that wrong? What if it doesn't let in the nutrients, but it lets in toxic things, waste things? What's going to happen to the cell? It's going to die, right? So it has some pretty specific requirements of what it needs to be letting in and out. And it doesn't get the chance to have multiple generations to get that right. Okay, so the idea of the random natural processes through Darwinian evolution would say, well, maybe the first cell did it okay, but the next generation of cells did a little bit better and a little bit better. Well, we don't get a second generation of cells if we die the first generation because we're letting in the wrong things and not letting out the right things, right? What if it never let any of the waste out from the cell? It would die as well. So something has to inform this cell membrane of what it needs to be letting out and what it needs to be letting in. And it has to get it right that very first generation of cells. So where is it getting those requirements of what to let in and out? So is that coming from a random process? I think it's better explained by a designer, setting the cell up in such a way that it can function this way and continue to live. Okay, the second major component is a cytoplasm. I think this is a really cool image of basically this cartoon picture of what it would look like in reality. These are all the organelles that are inside the cytoplasm. And all these different organelles have all these different functions. So if you look at here, all these different things are playing a critical role in keeping the cell alive because that's its main job, right? Don't die. So we have ribosomes that make proteins, the mitochondria that gives energy, the endoplasmic reticulum that transports different things through the cell. And the cell needs all of these things in order to function. And like I said, most of your textbooks are going to explain the cell or they're going to compare it to a factory. Okay, so what does a factory have to do? Well, it has to produce some product, right? And it has to have so many different machines that are producing different parts and assembling things in a different way in order to make that product come out at the end. But somewhere there has to be a plant manager, right? That's determining what machines are doing what function, how many of each of those machines. So what if our cell, let's say we're only made of mitochondria? Could it live? No, now it's going to have a lot of energy, but it can't do anything with it, right? What if all it had was the ribosomes? Could it still survive? No. So see, it needs all of these parts working together at the same time. So what's determining how many of these machines, right, if we're using that analogy, are in our cell in order for the cell to still live? Is that a random blind process through nature? Or did somebody intelligent set it up that way and organize it this way and make it an orderly process so that it could function? Right? If we're looking at the factory, we know there's somebody intelligent. There's the plant manager. There's somebody who's organizing the factory floor to have the right kinds of machines doing the right things in the right amounts. So we can make the same conclusion with the cell, that we have all of these different organelles that have to perform these functions, but we need that variety. We need the right amount in each organelle in order for the cell to still live. And so again, we don't have this multiple generations to get this right. If your first generation of cell only had mitochondria, we don't get a second generation of cells to try to get it right and try to improve on this. It needs all of these things from the beginning in order for it to work and for it to live. Okay. The third major component is the nucleus. What does a nucleus do? Right, it's like the brain of the cell, right? It's got the DNA. It has all of that information and information stored in a code. And that in itself tells us there must be intelligence behind it, because you can't get information out of random chaos. The information has to actually inform the cell of what to go do. And then it's taken a step even further by putting it into a coded fashion. Information can't appear out of nothingness. It said that a cell contains around 1 trillion bits of data that's instructing the cell on what to do and what to make and what to go produce in order to continue to live. And because it's stored in a code, we know there must be intelligence behind that. E.H. Andrews, he's a professor of materials at the University of London, says it's not possible for a code of any kind to arise by chance or accident. A code is the work of an intelligent mind. Even the cleverest dog or chimpanzee could not work out a code of any kind. So it's obvious then that chance cannot do it. Codes do not arise from chaos. Okay, so that's a really powerful quote. If you could memorize anything, I would suggest that one, because codes cannot come out of chaos. And that's what we see in our DNA, is that there's information, which requires intelligence, and then it's written in the code, which requires intelligence as well. So we go back to that question, which is the more logical conclusion? What is our presumption of fact? Can random chaos produce coded information that's directing and guiding the cells? Or is that an intelligent designer? Okay, and this is the basic building block of all life. So every living thing is based on this design that is still amazingly complex, and it shows organization with multiple components performing individual functions to keep the cell alive. So that's an indication of design, not randomness. Okay. We could also describe the cell in terms of irreducible complexity. Now that's a big phrase, but I think y'all have probably gone through this before. So when something is irreducibly complex, it means that it's a system that's made up of several well-matched integrated parts that all contribute to some overall function, where if you remove one of those parts, it stops working with that intended function. Okay, and I always like to give some basic everyday examples so we can kind of square away in our minds what that term means and then see how we can relate that to biology. Okay, so one example would be a simple mousetrap. Okay, so how many parts do you think there are to this mousetrap? It's pretty simple, right? But there's still 5 different pieces that are involved in order for this mousetrap to work. Okay, so we need the platform, right, the wooden part, the hold down bar, the hammer, the spring, and the catch. Okay, but we really need all of these pieces in order for this mousetrap to work in its intended function, right? Now you could find a function for maybe just the platform, right? I mean, it could be a paperweight, but how many mice does a paperweight catch? Not many, right? So if we were to try to explain this existence through a Darwinian evolution, random natural process, we would have to say, well, let's say we have just that platform, okay? And you can catch 1 mouse per month. And then several generations later, we have a random genetic mutation and we acquire the spring. And now we can catch 2 mice per month. So clearly the 2-part mousetrap is better than the 1-part mousetrap. So the 1-part mousetrap dies away and the 2-part mousetrap continues on. Generations later, there's another random genetic mutation and we get the catch, okay? Now we have 3 parts and we catch 3 mice per month. And of course, that's better than 2 mice per month. So the 2-part mousetraps die off and the 3-part mousetraps continue on. And we continue down this incremental improvement process that's done from nature, guiding this process through random acquisitions of these new components, and it's all coming together. So can we really explain the existence of this mousetrap that way? No, why not? Exactly. We don't catch any mice until we have all 5 parts working together. So there is no explanation of this simple buildup on slight successive modifications as we go from something really simple to improving it to something really complex. We are now what we would call irreducibly complex. We're complex and we can't reduce it down to any fewer components or we stop working. Okay, so granted, this is a man-made contraption. We know there's intelligence behind us that put this together. So really the question is, do we find this type of system, this type of irreducibly complex system in biology? Do we have mouse traps in our bodies, right? So we're going to look, there are actually thousands of examples that you could pull from. So we're going to go over just 2, just so that I don't keep you here all day. But the first one we're going to look at is the bacterial flagellum. Okay, so the flagellum is that whip-like appendage at the end of the bacteria that moves the bacteria through its environment. Okay, it propels it through its environment. It's made up of a protein that's shaped like a hollow tube, and there's like the sharp bend that comes out of the bacteria. I think this picture shows a little bit better of all the components to it. So look at all these different parts. We have the filament, we've got hooks, we've got L rings and P rings, all these different types of proteins. Okay, looks pretty complicated, right? We've got all of these different components where if you take one of them out, that flagellum won't work anymore. And this flagellum is critical to the life of the bacteria because it has to be able to move towards its food and away from things that are trying to eat him, right? So even when you look at the names of these components, it's really similar to how we would describe an engine. Okay, it's basically functioning like a rotary engine, only it's more complex than an engine that we've designed because it can change directions instantaneously based on a flow of protons across the cell membrane. Okay, so it's more efficient and works better than a man-made engine, but it has all the same types of components. Now, if you were to take one of the parts out of your engine of your car, what would happen? Right, it wouldn't work and you'd have to phone a friend for a ride, right? If you take one of these parts out of the flagellum of the bacteria, what happens? It dies, right? So this is a life critical thing. It's not something that we could slowly acquire piece by piece and that slight successive modification that nature would require it to do, okay? So when we look at this, it's irreducibly complex. We have to have all of these things integrated at one time. And just like our mousetrap though, what if in nature we did happen to have the L ring and the P ring and the C ring and all of these parts floating around? With our mousetrap, if we just had the platform and the spring and the catch scattered across this room, could we catch mice? No. What if the platform to the mousetrap were the size of this room and the spring were this big? Could we catch mice? No. What if they were all the right size, but they were just laying on top of each other on the table? Could we catch mice? No. So there's like an extra level of complexity. It's not just that all these pieces have to exist in the same time and in the same place, right? In the same cell. But they all have to be integrated. They have to be sized the right way. They have to have the right portions of what's necessary in order to make up the system. So this is a system that's irreducibly complex. If we take one of these pieces out, it does not continue to work, and the bacteria is a dead bacteria. And so that doesn't work very well for Darwinian evolution, right? Everything has to live and reproduce and continue on as it slowly acquires new parts. But we see that this system doesn't work at all unless all those parts are there and integrated in the right way. Okay? All right, so let's look at another example. This is probably my favorite one to go to because regardless of your theory of origins, whether you're an atheist who thinks that random and natural processes produced everything in life, or whether you're a theist where you think God stepped in or some intelligent being stepped in and created, you have to have this system work. And this is DNA replication. Okay, so we're going to walk just briefly through what DNA looks like so we kind of look at what that process of replication is. So if you look at the image on the screen, it's that double-stranded helix. We have 4 different, what they're called nitrogenous bases that bond together. A always bonds with T, and G always bonds with C. Okay, and this is our code, right? So the order of these letters basically is what's determining, whether you have brown eyes or blue eyes, whether you're going to develop, 2 arms and 2 legs, to be a human, right? This is what that coded information is doing, is directing the cell what to do and what to create, what to go make. Now, in order to continue life, for life to progress, we have to replicate this DNA. And so what we have to do is we have to split open those bases that are bonded so that we can start copying them, all right? So you don't have to know all of the terms of this process. I just want you to think big picture. What does this process look like and what does it involve, okay? So the first step is we have to have helicase. It's an enzyme that comes and it basically unzips that DNA. So instead of it being bonded together, it's split open, okay? But we need to hold it open. We can't just have it reattaching everywhere. So we need a single-stranded binding proteins to keep it open so we can come in and start copying. There's this enzyme called polymerase that comes along and it actually starts replicating all of those nitrogenous bases to form a mating pair of our DNA. But it can only work in one direction down the DNA. Okay, they're actually oriented just a little bit differently. They're clocked a little off. So for the other half of our DNA strand, we need a thing called ligase that comes in and tells the polymerase where to start replicating. And it's a different type of polymerase that has to come in, but it can only do it in like little chunks at a time. Well, chunky DNA doesn't do our body any good. So we need ligase to come in and glue it all together. Okay. So again, you have to memorize all of these terms, but think big picture. What all we need to split it open. We need to hold it open. We need to copy things. We need to glue things together. How many different things did we talk about there? We've got helicase, polymerase, proteins, ligase, primase, 2 different types of polymerase. That's a lot of different pieces, okay? What does that kind of start to sound like? That mousetrap, right? What if our body only had helicase, the one that unzips it? What can we do for DNA replication? Well, not much. We can break all our DNA in half. We can't do anything else. Can we replicate a cell with just helicase? What if all we had was polymerase, which is the thing copying all of those bases? Could we replicate DNA? Not if we can't unzip it, right? So we see we need all of those things in the cell at the same time working together in order for us to replicate any DNA. And again, if you can't replicate DNA, you can't continue life. That's how we make new cells and that's how we grow. So this type of system is considered irreducibly complex. Before the first cell could ever replicate, it would need all of these things in place, in the right place, at the right time, in the right amounts, in order to have the second generation of cells. And it's a system that doesn't just work, but it has to work with precision, right? Because when we mess up DNA replication, we can't produce a living cell. Okay, it requires it to work and work accurately. Okay, so again, what is the better explanation for a system like this on which all of life depends? Could we have gotten this through a random natural process? Or do we need an intelligent designer behind it? We need somebody to organize that system and get all of these enzymes and proteins in place in order for DNA to be replicated. So why is it important to show that these things are irreducibly complex? We talked about just 2 examples, the bacterial flagellum, DNA replication. In my book, I go into all kinds of other details, the protein synthesis mechanism. I talk about the blood clotting cascade, which is fascinating. All of that in chapter 2, all of those details can give you more examples of things that are irreducibly complex in nature that show there must be some designer. And why does that matter to show something irreducibly complex? Because if we can't build up on it from a random natural process of something simple slowly becoming more complex, then we have to have that designer. Design requires a designer. And we see these systems that have to function and function accurately. It means there has to be a designer behind it. So, so this is kind of summarizing that. If a complex design exists in nature, it requires multiple parts working together, then it cannot be done through nature alone. So that becomes evidence of intelligent design, and that design requires a designer. So I'll leave you with this quote from Charles Darwin, okay, who put forward the idea of Darwinian evolution. That's what it's named after. And he even says this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And it truly does when you look at things, especially like DNA replication. That is a complex system that cannot be formed by numerous successive slight modifications, just like that mousetrap. We can't slowly build up to that complexity. It has to be complex from the outset. And he says his theory would break down if we find examples of that. And there are thousands of those examples. You don't have to know the same two that we talked about today, but I encourage you to go look through biology, or when you're studying biology or chemistry or physics, and see those things that are irreducibly complex, and find one that you are particularly intrigued by and commit that to memory, because that is your example of that painting, that Mona Lisa, in the middle of all the paint splatters. If you have that painting that shows order and planning and intent and purpose, then you have to have that intelligent designer behind it. So what we've talked about today is, does God exist? Well, we talked first about the giant universe, right? All of those attributes of the universe are specific in order for life to exist here. Then we talked about the precision and accuracy of the cell, which is the most basic building block of all life. And then we talked about those irreducibly complex systems that are critical to life. And it's not probable, meaning the better explanation to those is that there's an intelligence behind it. It's not probable that they came about with that level of precision, with all of those complexities, all at the same time for life to exist. So those things have to be designed, and a designer requires a designer. All right, any questions or thoughts or comments on all of that? Because it was a lot, I know. Especially for a Sunday morning. Nothing, all of that was just explained so perfectly. We understand. Oh, great. Well, I did my job then. All right, well, I guess I'll hand it back over to, I don't know which one of you are closing us out.